Good evening. Tonight we descend into another universe, one that mirrors our own, yet diverges in subtle, profound ways. In this timeline, the year is 2100, and humanity stands at the precipice of extinction. The stars, once symbols of wonder and infinite possibility, have become harbingers of annihilation. And at the centre of this cosmic drama stands a man whose name carries the weight of prophecy, Michio Kaku, the physicist who saw what others refused to see, who spoke what others dared not speak, and who paid the ultimate price for illuminating a truth too terrible to accept. This is not the Michio Kaku of our world, not the brilliant theorist born in 1947, who spent his life making the mysteries of the cosmos accessible to millions. No, this is another Kaku, born in 2070, into a world transformed by the very technologies his predecessor once dreamed of. A world of fusion reactors and quantum computers, of Mars colonies and neural interfaces. A world that believed, with the characteristic hubris of advanced civilizations, that it had conquered the ancient threats that once haunted humanity's nightmares. In this timeline, humanity had grown comfortable. The climate crisis had been managed through atmospheric processes. War had been rendered obsolete by artificial intelligence mediators. Disease had been pushed to the margins by genetic therapies. The universe, it seemed, had been tamed. The cosmos had become a garden, and humanity its gardener. But the universe keeps its own counsel. And it was Michio Kaku, this younger Kaku, this prophet of the parallel world, who would remind humanity of a fundamental truth, that we are not masters of the cosmos but merely its temporary guests, that the universe operates on scales of time and power that dwarf our greatest achievements, that some threats cannot be negotiated with, cannot be managed, cannot be wished away. His warning came in the form of 3 simple characters, 3I, 3 letters that would shatter the illusion of safety, 3 letters that would divide a world, 3 letters that, in the end, would define the final chapter of human civilization as it had been known. Let us descend now into that world. Let us walk beside this man, brilliant and cursed in equal measure, as he makes his terrible discovery. Let us witness the collision between truth and denial, between one man's clarity and a civilization's desperate need to believe in its own permanence. The night is long, the story is dark, but perhaps in the telling we might glimpse something of ourselves. Michio Kaku was 30 years old when he first saw the data that would consume the rest of his life. The year was 2100, and Kaku worked at the Lagrange Institute for Deep Space Observation, a vast array of telescopes positioned at the Earth-Sun L2 point, far from the interference of human civilization. He had been assigned there after completing his doctorate at the new Princeton campus on Luna, his dissertation on exotic matter. Propulsion earning him recognition among the small community of physicists still interested in such theoretical pursuits. In an age where most brilliant minds flock to consciousness, uploading, or quantum economic modelling, Kaku represented something of an anomaly, a throwback to an earlier era when scientists gazed outward rather than inward. The institute was quiet that day. As it was most days, the work of cosmic observation had become largely automated, overseen by artificial intelligences that could process spectroscopic data millions of times faster than human minds. But Kaku, like his namesake from another timeline, possessed an almost romantic attachment to the act of discovery itself. He insisted on reviewing the raw data streams personally, spending hours each day immersed in the numbers and images that flowed from the Institute's instruments. It was during one of these sessions that he noticed the anomaly. 3I 2100P1. That was the designation assigned by the automated systems. The third interstellar object detected by humanity, observed in the year 2100, preliminary classification pending. The data suggested something enormous, something moving at speeds that defied conventional understanding of celestial mechanics. But it was the trajectory that made Kaku's breath catch in his throat. He ran the calculations once, then again, then a third time, convinced that he had made an error, that the software had glitched, that something, anything, must be wrong. But the numbers remained constant, implacable, merciless in their clarity. 3I 2100P1 was on a collision course with Earth, not a near miss, not a gravitational assist, not a trajectory that would carry it safely past the planet. A direct impact, and the timeline was impossibly, horrifically short. 14 months. Kaku sat in the dimness of the observation bay, surrounded by holographic displays showing the object's approach from a dozen different perspectives. It was massive. Preliminary estimates suggested a diameter of nearly 200 kilometers, roughly the size of one of Saturn's moons. It was moving at nearly 80 kilometers per second, far faster than any natural object should travel through interstellar space. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it was dark, absorbing rather than reflecting light, visible only through its gravitational influence on surrounding matter and the faint heat signature it emitted. In that moment, Michio Kaku understood that he stood at the threshold of the impossible. Everything he knew about interstellar objects, everything he had learned about the nature of celestial mechanics, suggested that what he was observing should not exist. Natural objects did not move at such velocities. Natural objects did not follow trajectories of such precision. Natural objects did not absorb light with such efficiency. But if it was not natural, then what was it? He named it Atlas, after the Titan condemned to hold the weight of the heavens. It seemed fitting. This object, whatever it was, now carried the weight of humanity's future on its trajectory. The next weeks passed in a fever of investigation. Kaku assembled a small team of colleagues, sworn to secrecy until the data could be verified. They observed Atlas from every available angle, employed every instrument at their disposal, ran simulations until the quantum processors overheated and had to be cycled into coolant baths. And with each passing day, the conclusion became more inescapable. Atlas was artificial. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The object's trajectory suggested course corrections inconsistent with gravitational influences alone. Its surface temperature was uniform in ways that natural bodies, even dark metallic asteroids, never achieved. Most tellingly, spectroscopic analysis revealed trace signatures of elements that should not exist in concentrations observed. Hafnium isotopes that suggested advanced nuclear processes, carbon structures that resembled manufactured composites. Someone or something had built this object, and whether through intention or malfunction, it was now hurtling toward Earth. Kaku presented his findings to the Institute's director in late March of 2100. Director Chen Lin was a pragmatist, a woman who had spent 40 years in space observation and had developed a healthy skepticism toward extraordinary claims. She listened to Kaku's presentation in silence, studying the data with the careful attention of someone who understood that what she was hearing could not be unheard. "You're certain of the trajectory?" she asked finally. Within 3 standard deviations, Kaku replied. We've modelled every possible gravitational influence, accounted for solar pressure, even considered relativistic effects. The margin of error places impact somewhere in Central Asia, plus or minus 2,000 kilometres, but impact is certain. Chen Lin was quiet for a long moment. Beyond the viewport, the earth hung like a blue jewel against the void, fragile, precious, impossibly vulnerable. And you believe it's artificial, she said. It was not quite a question. I believe we need to proceed as if it is, Kaku answered carefully. The alternative, that a natural object of this size, moving at this velocity, on this trajectory, should coincidentally intersect with Earth, the probability is so low as to be meaningless. Then we're looking at what? An attack? A malfunction? A test? Kaku shook his head. I don't know. The object is old. Spectral dating suggests it's been in flight for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands. Whatever launched it, whatever purpose it once served, may be long extinct. But its purpose now. He gestured at the holographic projection of Earth, at the point where Atlas's trajectory terminated. Its purpose now is clear. Chen Lin made her decision, with the swiftness that had defined her career. She authorized the release of Kaku's findings to the Global Science Council, the international body responsible for coordinating humanity's response to cosmic threats. She granted Kaku unlimited access to the Institute's resources, and she prepared herself for the storm she knew was coming. Because if Michio Kaku was right, if this impossible artificial object was indeed on a collision course with Earth, then humanity had 14 months to confront a threat unlike any it had ever faced. A threat that could not be reasoned with, could not be negotiated with, could not be wished away. A threat named Atlas. The data was transmitted on April 1st, 2100. Later, some would remark on the irony of the date, April Fool's Day, a celebration of harmless deceptions. But there was nothing harmless about what Kaku had discovered. And as the world began to process the implications of his warning, as governments convened and scientists argued, and the public descended into panicked speculation, one truth became abundantly clear. The comfortable age had ended, and the age of reckoning had begun. The response from the Global Science Council arrived within 72 hours of Kaku's initial transmission. It was not what he had expected. The council acknowledged receipt of the data. They thanked Kaku for his diligence. They assured him that his findings would be subjected to the most rigorous peer review. And then, in language that was simultaneously bureaucratic and threatening, they ordered an immediate halt to all public discussion of the matter pending official verification. Kaku read the message 3 times, each reading deepening his sense of unease. This was not the response of an organization mobilizing to meet an existential threat. This was the response of an institution buying time, managing narratives, controlling information flow. Within a week, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Kaku's colleagues began receiving visits from council representatives, not scientists, but administrators, lawyers, specialists in what was euphemistically termed crisis communications. They were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. They were reminded of the potential for public panic. They were, in the most polite possible terms, told to remain silent. The official statement, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of obfuscation. Yes, an interstellar object had been detected. Yes, it would pass relatively close to Earth. But there was no cause for concern. The trajectory calculations were preliminary. The probability of impact was negligible. The public should rest assured that the world's finest minds were monitoring the situation. Michio Kaku knew a lie when he heard one. More than that, he understood the machinery that produced such lies, the careful calibration of half-truths, the strategic omissions, the deployment of reassuring language to prevent uncomfortable questions. He had seen it before in smaller contexts. The suppression of climate data that suggested worse outcomes than models predicted, the quiet shelving of studies on consciousness upload failure rates, the gentle discouragement of research into potentially dangerous technologies. But this was different. This was not a matter of uncomfortable truths or politically inconvenient findings. This was the survival of the human species, and the council was lying about it. He confronted director Chen Lin in late April. She looked older than she had 3 weeks earlier, the weight of complicity etching new lines around her eyes. "They've asked me to recommend your reassignment," she said quietly. "Nothing punitive. A promotion, actually. There's a position opening at the Venus Terraforming Project. Important work. Generous compensation. A position that would conveniently place me on the other side of the solar system," Kaku replied. Chen Lin didn't deny it. "They're afraid of panic, Michio. They're afraid of what happens when 8 billion people realize they have a year to live. The social collapse, the violence, the complete breakdown of order. They think, they hope, that they can find a solution quietly. And maybe they're right. And if they're wrong, if there is no solution, then what? We just let humanity spend its last months living a lie?" "Would the truth be kinder?" Chen Lin's voice was soft, almost gentle. "Would it be better for people to spend those months in terror, watching the sky, knowing that death is coming and there's nothing they can do about it? Sometimes, Michio, the merciful thing is to let people live in ignorance until the end." Kaku felt something harden inside him. "I don't believe in merciful lies, Director, and I don't think you do either." He refused a reassignment, and with that refusal, he crossed a line from which there could be no return. The surveillance began subtly. His communications were monitored, though the intrusions were careful enough to maintain plausible deniability. His research access was restricted, framed as routine security updates. Colleagues began avoiding him in the Institute's corridors, their eyes sliding away when he approached, as if proximity to Kaku carried its own contagion. But Kaku had anticipated this. During those first frantic weeks after the discovery, he had made copies of everything: the raw observational data, the trajectory calculations, the spectroscopic analyses, the simulation results. He had stored them in multiple locations, some digital, some physical, some on servers so deeply buried in quantum encryption that not even the Council's most sophisticated AI could extract them without his cooperation. He became, in the span of a few weeks, what the Council most feared: a scientist with proof, with expertise, and with nothing left to lose. The first interview request came from Elena Vasquez, an independent journalist who had built a reputation investigating stories the mainstream media preferred to ignore. She had heard rumours, whispers about an interstellar object, about suppressed data, about a physicist at the Lagrange Institute who had been silenced. She reached out to Kaku through encrypted channels, proposing a meeting at a neural cafe in the Lunar Free Trade Zone where surveillance was prohibited by treaty. Kaku agreed. They met in early June in a booth designed to scramble monitoring algorithms. Vasquez was younger than he had expected, barely 25, but her eyes held the alertness of someone who had learned not to trust official narratives. "Tell me about Atlas," she said simply, and Kaku told her everything: the data, the trajectory, the impossibility of it being natural, the council's suppression, the lies being fed to a public that deserved to know the truth. He spoke for 3 hours, methodically laying out the evidence, anticipating every objection, addressing every alternative explanation. When he finished, Vasquez was quiet for a long time. "They'll destroy you for this," she said finally. "You understand that, right? Once this goes public, they'll do everything in their power to discredit you. They'll call you a fraud, a conspiracy theorist, a panic monger. They'll dig into every aspect of your life, looking for ammunition." "I know," Kaku said, "but what's the alternative? Let them manage humanity into extinction?" "Maybe they can stop it," Vasquez suggested. "Maybe they're building weapons, or planning evacuations, or, in 14 months, to stop an object 200 kilometers across moving at 80 kilometers per second. With what? Our most powerful nuclear devices would barely scratch it. Our fastest ships would take years to reach intercept positions. And evacuate where? Mars? Europa? Those colonies can barely support themselves, let alone absorb 8 billion refugees." Kaku leaned forward. "There is no secret plan, Elena. There's only denial and wishful thinking and the desperate hope that if we ignore it long enough, it will somehow go away." The interview was published on June 15th, 2100. The response was immediate and catastrophic. Within hours, the story had propagated across every information network in the solar system. The Global Science Council issued an emergency statement denouncing Kaku as a rogue scientist promoting unverified speculation. Leading physicists, many of whom Kaku noted bitterly, had never studied his actual data, appeared in media segments explaining why his calculations were flawed, his methodology questionable, his conclusions impossible. But the data was out there now, encrypted and distributed across 1,000 servers. Other scientists began examining it, running their own simulations, and slowly, reluctantly, a consensus began to emerge among those willing to look honestly at the evidence. Michio Kaku was right. Atlas was coming, and there was nothing that could stop it. The public reaction split along fault lines that had always existed but had remained mostly dormant in humanity's comfortable age. Some demanded action, though what action could be taken remained unclear. Some descended into fatalism, abandoning their responsibilities to spend their remaining time with loved ones or pursuing long-delayed desires. Some simply denied, clinging to the council's reassurances with the desperation of the drowning. And some turned their fear into rage, directed at the man who had shattered their illusions. Michio Kaku received death threats. His home was vandalized. Security services, nominally assigned to protect him, seemed perpetually unavailable when threats materialized into actual violence. In July, he was formally dismissed from the Lagrange Institute for breach of confidentiality protocols and unprofessional conduct. In August, his scientific credentials were suspended pending an ethics review that everyone understood would never conclude. In September, he was banned from entering government facilities, effectively cutting him off from the very instruments needed to continue tracking Atlas. But the surveillance networks continue to update. Amateur astronomers, citizen scientists, even some official observatories whose operators refuse to participate in the conspiracy of silence. They all tracked Atlas's approach. They shared their findings in encrypted forums, in samizdat publications, in whispered conversations, in places where monitoring was impossible. And the numbers remained unchanged. Impact was projected for October 17th, 2101, Central Asia, probable extinction-level event. Kaku spent those months doing what he could. He gave interviews to anyone who would listen, explaining the science, answering questions, trying to cut through the fog of denial and misinformation. He published papers detailing potential survival strategies, deep underground bunkers, sealed biodomes, genetic preservation archives. He worked with groups attempting to preserve human knowledge, encoding the entirety of human culture and science into quantum crystals that might survive the impact. But he also watched as the world slowly fractured, as governments collapsed under the weight of panic and denial, as the comfortable systems that had sustained billions began to fail, as humanity, faced with its own mortality, revealed both the best and worst of its nature. In late September, director Chen Lin visited him one final time. She had resigned from the Lagrange Institute, unable to continue participating in what she had come to see as a crime against humanity. "You were right," she said simply, "and I was a coward for not standing with you earlier." Kaku felt no satisfaction in being proven right. "It doesn't matter now. Right or wrong, Atlas is coming, and we're out of time. Then what do we do?" Kaku looked at the woman who had once been his mentor, who had chosen institutional loyalty over truth, who had finally found the courage to see clearly when clarity no longer mattered. "We witness," he said quietly. "We document. We ensure that if anyone survives, if anything persists, they know what happened. They know that humanity was given a warning and chose to ignore it. They know that the truth was spoken and was rejected in favour of comfortable lies. That's all we can do now. Bear witness. The days shortened. The nights grew longer. And Atlas, indifferent to human drama, continued its ancient journey toward its rendezvous with Earth. October 2101 arrived with the quality of a dream, from which there is no waking. The world had not ended, not yet, but the machinery of civilization was already grinding to a halt. Transportation networks had collapsed as workers abandoned their posts. Supply chains that had functioned with clockwork precision for decades simply stopped as panic and denial competed for humanity's attention. The Global Science Council had finally grudgingly acknowledged the reality of the threat in late September, but by then the admission came too late to matter. Michio Kaku spent those final weeks in a small observatory that Chen Lin had helped him access, a private facility owned by a wealthy eccentric who had decided that if humanity was ending, it might as well end with someone watching the skies. The equipment was older than what he had worked with at the Lagrange Institute, but it was sufficient, more than sufficient to track Atlas on its final approach. The calculations had become his meditation, his prayer, his anchor in a world coming undone. Every day he refined the impact predictions, narrowing the probability distribution, mapping the zones of total destruction and those marginal areas where survival might, just might, be possible. It was futile work in many ways. What difference did it make whether impact occurred at exactly 1437 UTC or 1442? What did it matter if the blast radius was 1,200 kilometers or 1,300? But the work gave him purpose, and in those final days, purpose was all that remained. Elena Vasquez visited him often during this period. She had become something like a friend, bound to him by their shared experience of being proven right about the thing they most wished to be wrong about. She was documenting everything, recording Kaku's final observations, interviewing survivors, creating a record that she hoped might outlast the catastrophe. "Do you think anything will survive?" she asked him one evening in early October, as they watched the latest projections playing across holographic displays. Kaku considered the question carefully. "Some things, yes. extremophiles in the deep oceans, microorganisms in subterranean environments, perhaps some animals in the deepest caves. The question isn't whether life will survive. Life is remarkably resilient. The question is whether intelligence, whether consciousness, whether human civilization, in any recognizable form, will persist. And I think we've known the answer to that for months, Elena. We've just been reluctant to say it aloud. They sat in silence, watching as Atlas grew larger in the telescope's view. It was visible to the naked eye now, a dark spot that seemed to swallow stars, growing incrementally larger each night. Some people refused to look at it, others couldn't look away. On October 10th, a delegation arrived at the observatory, representatives from the Emergency Preservation Council, a hastily assembled group that had taken over some governmental functions as traditional authorities collapsed. They had a proposal for Kaku. There were bunkers, they explained, deep underground facilities that had been constructed during humanity's paranoid century, designed to survive nuclear war, biological catastrophe, even limited asteroid impacts. They had been stocked with supplies, with genetic material, with preserved knowledge. They could support several thousand people for decades, perhaps centuries. Michio Kaku had earned a place in one of these sanctuaries. His expertise would be valuable in any post-impact world. His knowledge of physics, of cosmic phenomena, of the very event that had brought about this catastrophe, all of it would be needed if humanity was to have any chance of rebuilding. What about the others? Kaku asked quietly. Others? The delegation leader seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. The 8 billion people who aren't being offered bunker space, the children in Jakarta, the farmers in Uganda, the artists in Sao Paulo, the teachers in Mumbai. What about them? Dr. Kaku, you must understand the reality of the situation. The bunkers have limited capacity. Decisions have to be made. Yes, Kaku interrupted. Decisions have to be made, and I'm making mine. He refused the offer. The delegation tried to reason with him, tried to impress upon him the importance of preserving scientific knowledge, of ensuring humanity's future. But Kaku was unmoved. He had spent months watching the powerful and privileged abandon their responsibilities to the broader human family. He had seen how quickly the ideal of universal human dignity collapsed when it conflicted with personal survival. He would not participate in that final abandonment of principle. If there is a future, he told them, it shouldn't be built on the foundation of choosing some lives over others. If humanity is to persist, it should be because we found a way to save everyone, or because random chance spared someone to carry on. But I won't be part of a selection process that treats survival as a privilege to be earned rather than a right to be shared. They left without him. Elena Vasquez, who had witnessed the exchange, asked him if he had any regrets. About refusing the bunker? No. About what I could have done differently in these past months? Kaku paused, staring at the displays showing Atlas's approach. I regret that I wasn't more persuasive, that I couldn't find the words to make people understand earlier, when time remained for meaningful action. I regret that I allowed anger to colour my advocacy, that I sometimes spoke from frustration rather than compassion, but the core of it, speaking the truth, refusing to participate in the lie. No, I don't regret that. The final days passed in a strange calm. The panic had burned itself out. What replaced it was a kind of exhausted acceptance, tinged with disbelief that persisted, even as Atlas grew to dominate the night sky. People gathered with loved ones. Some sought meaning in religion, in philosophy, in ancient practices that promised transcendence or acceptance. Others simply sat and waited. Kaku continued his observations until the very end. On October 16th, 24 hours before projected impact, he transmitted his final calculations to every server, every archive, every repository he could access. The data was precise now, refined through months of continuous observation. Impact would occur at 1441 UTC on October 17th, 2101. The location was pinpointed to within 10 kilometers, the Taklamakan Desert in what had once been Western China. The energy release would be equivalent to several trillion tons of TNT, enough to vaporize everything within 1,000 kilometers instantly and trigger cascading effects that would render the surface of Earth uninhabitable for centuries. His final transmission included not just the data, but a message. To whoever finds this, we knew. We had 14 months' warning. We had the intelligence to understand what was coming. What we lacked was not knowledge, but wisdom. We could not overcome our denial, our institutional inertia, our tendency to comfort ourselves with lies when truth became too painful. Let this stand as our final testament. Humanity ended not because we lacked the capacity to understand the cosmos, but because we lacked the courage to face what that understanding revealed. If you are reading this, if you survived, learn from our failure. Truth, however terrible, is always preferable to comforting delusion. Always. He signed it simply. Michio Kaku, physicist, October 16th, 2101. That final night, Elena Vasquez joined him at the observatory. They didn't speak much. There seemed little left to say. They simply watched as Atlas filled the screens, as its dark mass blotted out the stars, as it drew closer to its ancient appointment with Earth. "Do you think it was really artificial?" Eleanor asked finally. "Or did we just need it to have meaning? Did we need to believe that something intelligent sent it, rather than accepting that the universe is just random and uncaring?" Kaku smiled faintly. Does it matter? Whether it was built by some long-dead civilization or flung our way by cosmic chance, the result is the same. We're here. It's there. And in, he checked the countdown, 16 hours and 23 minutes. Those two facts will intersect in a rather definitive way. "I'm glad I'm here with you," Helena said quietly. At the end, "I'm glad I'm not alone." "None of us are alone," Kaku replied. 8 billion people are sharing this moment, whether they acknowledge it or not. We're all together in this final experience. That has to count for something. The night passed. The sun rose on October 17th, 2101, the last sunrise that Michio Kaku, or Elena Vasquez, or most of humanity would ever see. The sky was clear, crystalline, impossibly beautiful. It seemed wrong somehow that the world should end on such a perfect day. At 1441 UTC, Atlas entered Earth's atmosphere. The end came swiftly. The bunkers, in the end, were inadequate. The planners had anticipated nuclear war, biological catastrophe, even modest asteroid impacts. But Atlas was beyond their worst scenarios. The kinetic energy of the impact, the seismic shockwaves that propagated through the entire planet, the vaporized rock that was blasted into the atmosphere. These effects overwhelmed even the deepest shelters. Most failed within days as geologic upheaval breached their seals. Others lasted weeks or months before supplies ran out or systems failed. But some survived, not many. A few thousand individuals scattered across the globe, in facilities that happened to be positioned optimally, built slightly deeper, shielded slightly better than their counterparts. They emerged years later into a world transformed beyond recognition. The sky was dark with particulates that would take decades to settle. The oceans were acidic and largely lifeless. The great cities of humanity's comfortable age were gone, buried under ash or shattered by earthquakes. Among the survivors were a handful of scientists who had known Michio Kaku, who had worked with him, or interviewed him, or simply followed his work during those final frantic months. And they carried with them his final transmission, preserved on quantum crystals that had survived the catastrophe. The rebuilding was slow, agonizing, fraught with failures and setbacks. The survivors numbered too few to maintain the technological complexity that had defined pre-impact civilization. Skills were lost, knowledge forgotten, carefully preserved archives rendered useless without the infrastructure to access them. Humanity regressed not to stone tools and campfires, but to a simpler technological baseline, one that could be sustained by thousands rather than billions. But Kaku's message persisted. It became, over generations, something like a sacred text, not in the religious sense, but as a foundational document that shaped how post-impact humanity understood itself. The warning that had been ignored became the lesson that could not be forgotten. The comfortable lies that had paralyzed humanity's response became the cautionary tale told to each new generation. They called them the Kaku principles, those guidelines extracted from his life and work. Truth over comfort. Always. Warning signs must be heeded, not managed. Institutional preservation cannot supersede species survival. Denial is not a strategy. The irony was not lost on historians of the rebuilding era. Michio Kaku had been vilified, dismissed, persecuted during his lifetime for speaking uncomfortable truths. He had died, vindicated but powerless, proven right in the worst possible way. Yet it was his voice, his data, his final message that became the cornerstone of how humanity rebuilt itself. 3 centuries after the impact, when the skies had finally cleared and humanity had established stable populations in scattered enclaves, the first Kaku Memorial Observatory was constructed. It was a modest facility by pre-impact standards, a simple telescope array dedicated to monitoring near-Earth objects and interstellar visitors. But it represented something profound. A commitment to watching the skies, to heeding warnings, to never again choosing comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth. The dedication plaque bore a simple inscription. Here we watch, here we warn, here we remember Michio Kaku, who spoke when silence was easier, who warned when warning was unwelcome, who chose truth when lies were comfortable. May we prove worthy of his example. Over subsequent centuries, as humanity slowly expanded, as populations recovered and technologies were rediscovered or reinvented, the Kaku observatories multiplied. Each settlement, each nascent community established its own facility. They became more than simple telescopes. They were symbols of vigilance, reminders of the cost of denial, monuments to the man who had tried to save a world that would not save itself. Scholars in later ages would debate the details of Kaku's life. Had he been as heroic as the legend suggested, or simply a man doing what he believed was right? Was his persecution as severe as the stories claimed, or had it been embellished over centuries of retelling? Did he actually refuse the bunker space from pure principle, or were there other factors at play? But these debates ultimately missed the point. What mattered was not whether every detail of his story was precisely accurate, but that the story itself captured something essential about humanity's confrontation with existential truth. That when faced with catastrophe, one man had chosen clarity over comfort, had sacrificed his position and safety to speak what others refuse to hear. The universe, after all, operates on its own timeline, indifferent to human wishes or fears. Stars explode, galaxies collide, objects hurtle through the void on trajectories set millions of years in motion. These things happen whether we acknowledge them or not. The question that defines a civilization is not whether it faces such threats. All civilizations do, but how it responds when the warning comes. Pre-impact humanity had failed that test. It had chosen institutional inertia over urgent action, had elevated short-term stability over long-term survival, had dismissed the prophet because the prophecy was too terrible to accept, and it had paid the ultimate price for that choice. Post-impact humanity, building from the ashes, chose differently, not because people were wiser or braver, but because they had Michio Kaku's example before them. They had his data, his warnings, his final message reminding them that truth, however terrible, was always preferable to comfortable delusion. In the year 2501, 4 centuries after the impact, humanity finally developed the technological capacity to send a mission beyond the solar system. The destination was carefully chosen. The trajectory that Atlas had followed back into interstellar space, retracing its path to discover, if possible, its origin. The mission was named, inevitably, the Kaku expedition. Its mandate was simple: find where Atlas had come from, understand why it had been launched, determine whether other such objects might exist. It was a journey that would take centuries, that those who launched it would never see completed. But it represented something profound: humanity, not just recovering from catastrophe, but actively seeking to understand the universe that had nearly destroyed it. The expedition's departure was marked by ceremonies across every human settlement. In each, someone would read Kaku's final transmission, that last message sent into the void as Atlas approached. And in each, someone would add the words that had become traditional. He warned us, we ignored him. We paid the price, never again. Whether the universe was listening, no one could say, but humanity was listening now. And perhaps that was enough. The night is long, and the story is dark. But in the darkness there is also light, the light of one man's courage, of his commitment to truth, of his refusal to participate in the comfortable lie, even when the price of honesty was everything he had. Michio Kaku of that other timeline never saw the world he helped create through his sacrifice. He died in the impact, along with most of humanity, his final observations transmitted to servers that would later be unearthed and preserved. He died vindicated but defeated, proven right in the worst possible way. Yet his legacy endured. Not in monuments or statues, though those would come in time, but in the fundamental shift in how humanity understood its relationship with truth, with warning, with the cosmos itself. He had forced humanity, in its final months, to confront the reality of its own mortality. And while that confrontation came too late to save his world, it came just in time to shape the next one. The universe keeps its own counsel. It sends its warnings in the language of mathematics and light, of gravity and motion. Whether we listen to those warnings, whether we heed them or dismiss them, that choice remains eternally our own. Michio Kaku chose to listen, chose to warn, chose truth over comfort, even when truth meant the end of everything. And in the end, perhaps that is the only immortality that matters, not survival, but the knowledge that when the moment came, when the choice was presented, he chose rightly. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent and eternal, and somewhere in that vast darkness, another Atlas might even now be beginning its journey. The question is not whether such threats exist. They always have. They always will. The question is whether we are listening. Good night.